movement. And there's a Mishnah, a law that says that if you read the Megillah backward, you don't fulfill your obligation. What does it mean, read the Megillah backward? So the simple meaning is if you read chapter 10 before chapter 9 or chapter 2 before chapter 1, you don't fulfill your obligation. That's the simple meaning. But the Baal Shem Tov says that there's another meaning in someone who reads the Megillah backward. Backward in Hebrew, that same word could be the mafreya, could mean if someone reads the Megillah as if it's a story that happened in the past. So if I'm reading the story and I say, well, wonderful story, is a cute story, it happened in the past, we're just thinking about it and remembering it, says the Baal Shem Tov, oh, I didn't fulfill my obligation. Because to fulfill the obligation of listening to the story, I have to listen to it and read it as if it's relevant to us. So it's true about all parts of Torah, but the Baal Shem Tov said it specifically about the Megillah. So that's one introduction. When you read the Megillah, the first thing that jumps out at you is that the question of why it's in the Bible. It's one of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, and it's the book that does not mention God's name at all. I think it's the only book that does not mention God's name at all. So if it doesn't mention any God's name, so why is it in the Bible? So one of the big ideas of the Scroll of Esther is that what the story is telling us is to find God even when God is not obvious. In other words, if the person who wrote the scroll, the sages who wrote the scroll, wrote it and wrote, oh, God intervened and God did this and God did that, that would miss the point. The whole point of the book is that the book recounts events where it seems like there's no godly intervention. And the fact that the story turns out in a positive way for the Jews, it seems like it's all coincidence. And we have 10 chapters of just events that just so happen to click in a way that would come and help the Jewish people. So the person who's writing, the sages who wrote the Megillah, wrote the scroll, wrote it in a way that specifically you should not be able to see God's presence. And that's the whole purpose of the book. The whole purpose of the book is to understand that God is present even when it's not obvious. And that's the number one takeaway. And in some sense, that's why Purim is unique, a unique holiday, different than all other holidays. Because all other holidays, what do we celebrate? We celebrate divine intervention in some form or another, or some miraculous battle. Even Hanukkah is a miraculous battle while the Jews are in Israel. So there's all kinds of, so that's a time when we feel close to God. The holiday of Purim is the only holiday that we celebrate that took place when the Jewish people were not in Israel. They were in exile. They didn't sense the presence of God. And nevertheless, everything worked out for the benefit of the Jewish people. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that God is present even when he conceals himself. Even when God is concealed, God is present. And that's probably one of the most important takeaways of the Scroll of Esther, or the Megillah of Esther. Now, just to elaborate on that point for one moment before we start getting into the actual story, the name Esther means concealment. Okay, so this is part of the beauty here, part of the poetry here. The name Esther means concealment, and when Esther, the Talmud says everything has to be alluded to in the Torah. Where does the Torah give a hint to the story of Purim? Even though the story of Purim was many generations after the Torah was given, many centuries after the Torah was given, but everything in the Torah, there's some allusion to the story, to the future. So the Talmud says that there's a verse toward the end of the Torah, the last day of Moshe's life. Moshe says that God says, Anochi, on that day I will hide my face. In other words, when the Jewish people are in exile, God will hide his face. And the Hebrew word is haster astir, hiding I will hide, double language. But it uses the term haster astir, which is the word Esther. And what the Talmud is telling us is that in the times of Esther, when Esther, God's presence was concealed, make no mistake, God's presence was concealed, but it's not that he wasn't there. He was present, he was just concealed. So that's an interesting idea of why the scroll is called Esther. because as we know, Esther was not her only name. She had two names. We'll get to that in a minute. Esther was the name that represents concealment. So everything we're going to read about is about the layers. There are layers of reality, and the whole purpose of the story is to understand that we have to look beneath the layer, beneath the mask, and find God even when God is not obvious. Now, this also explains, this is all part of the first introduction, make no mistake. This also explains why we dress up on Purim. Everybody dresses up on Purim. Why do we dress up on Purim? We dress up on Purim not because we're trying to hide. We dress up on Purim because we want to encourage people to look beneath the mask, right? If I show up at your door with a mask, what's the first question you ask? You say, who's behind the mask? Okay. Had you not known I'm wearing a mask, you don't even realize to look beneath the mask. You look at me, you think you see what you get. You think that what you see is what you get, and you don't look deeper. So you know there's a mask, so you don't look deeper. But when you know there's a mask, if there's a mask, then I want to figure out what's beneath the mask. So wearing the mask on Purim encourages us to look beneath the mask and look and see what is behind, what's the inner story. And of course, the inner story of reality is the fact that God is present even when he's not obvious. So that's by way of general introduction. One general introduction. The idea of Purim is the idea we have a scroll here that does not say the name of God because God's name is not present in an obvious way. God is not present in an obvious way, but we look beneath the mask and we understand that all the coincidence is clearly God's hand. So that's one idea of the concealment. Now we have another problem. The other problem with the Scroll of Esther, and why we called it Unmasking the Scroll of Esther, is because who wrote the scroll and when was it written? So the sages wrote the scroll, but they wrote it when they were still living under the sovereignty of King Ahasuerus. And kings today, and especially kings back then, they don't like when you speak against them. They don't like when you stop being too critical. So usually when we write the story, we can write whatever we want about the Pharaoh because he's drowned in the sea, and we could say whatever we want. But if we're living under Ahasuerus, you've got to be very, very careful of how you tell the story because you cannot mock the king too much because the king is not going to be too happy. So part of the idea that we call it the Scroll of Esther, it's like the scroll of hidden, because it's clear that in the story, there are hidden messages. And part of the story are messages that we cannot say clearly. Like, for example, if we have to mock the king, we can't do it clearly. We have to do it subtly. And many people believe that that's what the Torah, that's what the Megillah is doing. So when we study the Megillah, we have to look at it on multiple levels. What is the message? What is beneath the surface of the message? What are things that could be said explicitly? What are things that cannot be said explicitly? And we have to look at it and understand that if any text has layers, this text has even more layers because for political reasons, for reasons of survival, this was written under the sovereignty of the king, and therefore we have to, the sages who wrote it had to tread carefully. So that is the second introduction, and now we can start thinking about the actual story. So if you want to think about the actual story, the first question to figure out is when to place the story. When did the story happen? And according to the sages, the story happens as follows. The Jewish people came into Israel, as we know. They lived there for about 400 years. Then they built a temple, which stood for about another 410 years. And then there was the destruction of the first temple, and the Jews were exiled to Babylonia. Okay. When they were in Babylonia, they understood that they're going back to Israel. Why so? Because the prophet Jeremiah told them that 70 years after Babylonia, after the exile, after the rise of Babylonia, you're going to go back to Israel. So if you're living in Babylonia, you're looking at your clock and you say, okay, you want to count to 70 years. And what happens is that 70 years pass and nothing happens. The Jewish people are still in Babylonia. They don't have their sovereignty. And at this point, the Jewish people feel that what they hoped for, God's promise, had not been fulfilled. So the only logical conclusion is that God had abandoned the Jewish people. And therefore, there's nothing to hope for to go back to Israel. and therefore you have to be you have to do everything that you could to survive in the Persian Empire on the terms of the Persian Empire. Now, the Jewish people were not the only people counting the 70 years. If you are the Babylonian king or the Persian king, which inherits the Babylonian kingdom, because the Persian kingdom took over the Babylonian kingdom, then you're also looking at the clock because you also believe in the prophet and you also want to know what's going to happen in 70 years. The Jewish people are going to rebel. Does that mean Babylonia and Persia are going to lose their power in the region? So they're also very nervous. So the Talmud says this story, the opening scene of the Megillah, the third year of the reign of Achashverosh, is the time when, according to the calculation, the 70 years of Babylonia pass. 70 years of Babylonia pass, and the Jewish people now realize that there's a problem. They're not going back to Israel. And the king also now realizes that he has nothing to worry about because he is secure on a seat. And therefore, he makes this great party for 180 days. Long party, half a year almost. Now, of course, we understand that God didn't abandon the people. And the reason why the Jewish people did not, the second temple was not built then was because they miscalculated. Because Jeremiah, I don't want to get into the details here, but there were stages in the exile, in the Babylonian exile. The Babylonians took over Jerusalem. They took the king Yehoiachin to exile, and they instated another king, a Jewish king, Tzidkiah. And then 11 years later, Tzidkiah rebels against Babylonia, and then the Babylonians come again and destroy the city and take the rest of the people to exile. So it's not clear. They miscalculated of when we're supposed to count the 70 years. And the truth is, it's supposed to count the 70 years from the final exile, from when Tzidkiah was sent to exile. Okay, so the details are not so important, the dates are not so important, but put yourself as a Jew in the Persian Empire, in Shushan. You've been waiting, you realize, and the king realizes that the Jewish people are not going back to Israel. God probably has abandoned them, and now the king is happy because the king feels secure in his kingdom, and now the story could start. So this is just to put us in the environment of the concealment. We feel like we don't have the divine protection. Go ahead, Vicky. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question. So if the Jews miscalculated, and according to their calculation, it's 70 years passed already, why didn't they rebel? Because they knew that after 70 years, God will be on their side.
Well, we don't want to rebel. We don't want to rebel. It's not that when the Jews came to Jeremiah, when the Jews came to Babylonia, the prophets told them that they should pray and be loyal to the kingdom where they are at, even though it was a terrible kingdom of Babylonia that destroyed the first temple. But nevertheless, the Jews don't rebel, generally speaking. The Jews were loyal. They were expecting divine intervention. And in fact, I don't want to say divine intervention, they were expecting some political event to allow the building of the temple. Now, what happens was, without getting too much into details, what happens was a little earlier, there was Cyrus, the king, the Persian king, who gave permission to build the temple, but then he stopped, he rescinded the permission. And now the building was in limbo. Nothing was happening. There's no development. And only later did they get the permission again. So there was no divine intervention, but at some point, the Persian Empire allowed for the building of the temple, and that's how the second temple was built. But the point of the matter is that if you're just putting yourself in the shoes of the Jews living in Babylonia at the time, you feel completely abandoned by God, and therefore you're very vulnerable. You want to fit into Persian society because that's where you're going to get your protection, according to your opinion.
Thank you.
Now there's a lot to say, but I'm just going to show you. I want to just show you chapter 1, which describes a lot of the great feast of Achashverosh, who throws a party for 180 days, and it seems like we're trying to glorify the king and glorify the power of the king, and glorify how this is the king was so kind to everybody, inviting everybody to the meal. But on closer reading, we will see that there are a lot of, it's actually mocking the king. Chapter 1 is complete mockery of the king from the beginning to the end. So I'm going to pull up the chapter 1. I will just read it a little bit. And really, we can do this to every chapter. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time. So we will do a little bit of, we'll do a little chapter 1, maybe a little chapter 4, Whoops. And we'll see what we have time for. But just to give an example of that there are things beneath the surface that are not so obvious, and how the Torah is alluding to it. The sages who wrote the scroll are alluding to it, but they don't want to openly mock the king. Okay, so we're looking at right here at the Scroll of Esther. It has 10 chapters. Chapter 1. It opens, it came to pass in the days of Achashverosh. He was the Achashverosh who reigned from Hodu to Cush. 127 provinces. So we're talking about the greatness of the king, okay? In those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a banquet for all the princes and his servants, the armies of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces who were before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty. Many days, 180 days. So it makes a party for 180 days for the ministers. And then, verse 5, and when these days were over, the king made for all the people present in Shushan, the capital, for everyone, both great and small, a banquet for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's orchard. Imagine the president would say, everybody is welcome to come to the White House for a party for 7 days, and they pull out all the royal, furniture. So verse 6, there were spreads of white, fine cotton, and blue, embroidered with cords of linen and purple, on silver rods and marble columns, couches of gold and silver, on pavement of green, white, shell, and onyx marble. And they gave them to drink golden vessels, and vessels differed from one another. And royal wine was plentiful according to the bounty of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, with no one coercing. For so had the king ordained upon every steward of his house, to do according to every man's wish. So we have 8 verses describing the wealth of the king and the generosity of the king, inviting everybody to the party. Then we get into the story with Vashti, not verse 9. Vashti also has a party, and then the king calls Vashti. She doesn't want to come. The Vashti is out of the picture, probably put to death. And then the story can unfold with Esther. But let's look at these verses for a second. So what is it? What are these verses doing? Well, of course, they're glorifying the king. Now, the end of the Megillah, chapter 10, is a short chapter, but it also talks about the glory of the king. It says, the king places taxes on the land, and read the history books, and you'll see how mighty this king is. Okay? So we're looking at the story. Chapter 1 and chapter 10, the beginning and the end, so the borders of the book seem to be saying this king is so mighty and so powerful. Okay? And it's almost like that's the theme that the Torah wants you to walk away with, the book wants you to walk away with. But the truth is, in the Scroll of Esther, everything is opposite. What seems to be praising the king is really a mockery of the king. Why is it a mockery of the king? Because we start and finish, look how great the king is. And now the entire book is about how powerless the king is. Why? Everybody takes advantage of this guy. He does exactly what he's told to do. First by his ministers, then by his wife Esther, then by Haman, then by Esther. This person is completely passive. He's acted upon. He doesn't make any decisions. So you see how the Torah, the scroll sets it up. Wow, what a mighty king, what a powerful king. And it concludes, what a powerful king. And really it's a mockery. This king has no power. He's being acted upon all the time. What is it a mockery of? It's not just a mockery of the kingdom of this individual king. It's a mockery of the human king. It's a mockery of the king who thinks he's in control. And in the reality, once you read the details, you realize that the king who thinks he's so powerful is not in control. And other people are acting through him, and God is acting through him. So it seems to set up the king is so powerful. It concludes with the king is so powerful, and boom, what happens in the whole book? The whole book, you see the opposite is true. So that contrast is a critique of the king, not just of the king, but of the human kingdom, of the human what's the fantasy of power, the human's idea that the human certainly has power. So that's one idea. Another idea, very much connected to this parsha. We can't critique the king, but we have to say, it looks like a festive party. And the Talmud says that all the Jews went to the party because it was a great party. If you're invited, the Jews are very happy to come because they feel accepted into Shushan society and they want to go to the party. According to the Talmud, that was a very big sin, but it doesn't say so clearly in the book. So it looks like this great party, okay? Now, the sages say, you got to read this carefully. Look at verse 6. What does he have in verse 6? In verse 6, we talk about their 7-day festival for all the people in the Shushan in the king's courtyard. What does the king display? There were spreads of white, fine cotton, and blue embroidered with cords of linen and purple. Okay, I'll stop here. If you look at the scroll where I'm pointing, the chet is a large chet. In the Bible, most letters are the same size. Some letters are small, some letters are big. If it's a big letter or a small letter, it's here to tell you a message. There's a big chet, there's a big 8. The letter chet represents the letter 8. What's the big chet? So the Talmud says the big chet is an allusion to number 8. What's 8? So 8, and this, by the way, is connected to this week's parsha, which we're not reading because it was postponed, because it was pushed away for the Purim class. But if it would not be Purim, we would be speaking about, you know what we'd be speaking about right now if it were in Purim? We would be talking about the 8 garments of the high priest. This week's parsha, God tells Moshe to make 8 beautiful garments for the high priest, for beauty and for splendor. Now, the Talmud says, what was displayed at that party? What did Achashverosh wear? He wore the 8 garments of the high priests that the Babylonians took from the Jewish people, from Jerusalem. And when he is wearing them, he's displaying the fact that he's, of course, desecrating it, but he's saying there's no more temple. This is not for the temple. We're not afraid of God. He's not afraid of punishment. Nothing's going to happen to him. Shushan is the new temple. Now, this is alluded to in verse 8 with a big chet, but also with the white, fine cotton, blue, embroidered, the cords of linen and purple. All these terms are the materials that were used in this week's parsha, creating the 8 garments of the high priest. So again, we can't open up and say that, oh, it was a terrible party for the Jews because the king came and wore the 8 garments of the high priest. You can't do that. You're living under the Achashverosh. You have to self-censor. So what do? They make a big 8, big chet, which represents 8. And you put 1, 2, and 2 together and you figure out what's happening here. Now comes the funniest idea. It's actually funny. We want to say how generous the king was. Everybody could drink as much wine as they want. So let's look at verse 8. This is really funny. Okay. And the drinking was according to the law, with no one coercing. For so had the king ordained upon every steward of his house to do according to every man's wish. What does it mean that the drinking was according to the law with no coercing? And the king said to do according to the wish of every person. So the Talmud says that in the Persian society, you went to a party, they would force you to drink. There are different versions to force you to drink a large amount, force you to drink wine that's at least your age. Basically, they come to the party. They didn't tolerate any party poopers. They wanted everybody to be invested and drunk so they can have a good time, as we see what happens with Vashti. But the bottom line is they would force you to drink. What happens at this party? This party, the king is so benevolent. Nobody's forced. Everybody could drink whatever they want. Ein honest. We're not forcing anybody. Free country. And again, it's here to highlight how this king, if you read nothing except for verse 8, the king is so nice. He even lets you drink however much you want. How do you read the story? What's the inner way to read the story? This king, so we're sitting and reading, we assume the king is so benevolent and so encouraging of freedom. No, what this tells you is that there was an exception to the rule. Could you imagine? The king did not force you to drink a certain amount of wine. That's the news. What does that tell you? That every single other thing in that country was regulated by the king, and people had no control and no ability to make their own decisions. I say, wow, what a wonderful party. We were not forced by the king to drink wine. Okay, what are you really saying? You're really saying that this guy's a dictator and he forces everyone to do exactly what he wants. So you're critiquing the dictatorship by highlighting, wow, there was once a party and it didn't make people drink. Wow, isn't that benevolent? Isn't that beautiful? So again, these are subtleties, but they're important to understand how the Megillah is written and what's the environment that this is taking place in, what environment they were operating under in the Megillah.
Rabbi,
Yes.
was Ahasuerus the father of Cyrus?
No, he wasn't the father. He really wasn't a person he didn't come from the royal family. What happens is the way he gets the king is the thing with Vashti. Vashti is the descendant of, Vashti is the granddaughter of the Nebuchadnezzar, the person who destroyed the first temple. So she's the grandchild of the Babylonian king. He marries her, and that's how he becomes the king. And that's why the Talmud says, that's why what the verse says is, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom. Now again, you have to know how to read something subtle. When it says in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, what you're really saying, according to the sages, is he did not belong on the kingdom. He wasn't from the royal family. It happened to be in those days he came onto the king, right? So if you say in those days, instead of saying in those days King Ahasuerus reigned, no, in those days King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom. What does that tell you? He didn't really belong there. And part of the problem here is that he's only the king because he marries Vashti. Now, in the end of this chapter, he gets into a fight with Vashti and probably has her killed. He gets rid of her and she can't come back. So he probably has her killed. Many people believe, the sages believe, what's really at stake here is he is afraid of that she now will take the power back, and there are people loyal to the Babylonian Empire in his kingdom, and they are a political threat. So he's very happy to get rid of Vashti because Vashti is really the source of his power, reminding him that he's not from the royal family. He's only here because of his wife. Okay, so again, that's really the fight between him and his wife. That's the tension here. And I'll show you one more point here that you can see this actually, again, very, very subtle, but there's an interesting point. So how do you describe how do we describe Vashti? So if you look at verse 9, also Vashti the queen. So we say Vashti the queen. First her name, then her title, Vashti the queen. Also Vashti the queen made a banquet for the women in the royal house of King Ahasuerus. Okay. On the seventh day, when the king's heart was merry with wine, he ordered Memuchan, Bizisa, Harvona, Bigta, Avata, Zetar, Charkas, the 7 chamberlains of the minister who ministered in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the royal crown, to show the peoples and his princes her beauty, for she was of comely appearance. So they're all drunk. They want to bring Vashti. She's beautiful. He wants to present her before everybody. What he's really trying to do is humiliate her and say, you have to listen to me, which is why she doesn't want to come. 12. But Queen Vashti refused to come. Okay. So here's a subtlety. Subtlety is in verse 9 and in verse 11, it says Vashti the queen. First her name, then her title. Why? That's Ahasuerus' perspective. He calls her Vashti the queen. You're Vashti. That's your name. You're the queen, not because you're the queen. You're only the queen because you're married to the king. Now, scroll down to 11. When she refuses, verse 12, it doesn't say Vashti the queen. It says, but Queen Vashti refused. What's the difference between Vashti the queen and Queen Vashti? It seems like a subtlety. No, but she puts the word, when the verse discusses her perspective, it says queen first. What she is saying is, I'm the queen. I don't have to listen to you. You're only the king because you're married to me. Now, again, we can't write this dispute in the book. The king's not going to be happy. So we have a subtlety. Vashti the queen or Queen Vashti. The word that's first is dominant. So from the perspective of the king, she's Vashti. She's not a queen. But from her perspective, no, I'm the queen. You're only the king because you married me. Again, subtlety, but you have to know where to look.
Okay, my question also had to do with another subtlety, the difference in attitude towards the Jews, towards others, are represented by Ahasuerus and Cyrus, who I guess, I don't know if he followed him directly in the next succession or where he stood in relation, because we're talking about his attitude toward the Jewish people, or his who is in charge, and the fact that Cyrus was the one who directed all the captive people back to their capitals to rebuild as allies. Just where where that turnabout came.
So
Was my question.
Koresh was a Persian king before Achashverosh.
Who was?
He was a Persian king before Achashverosh.
Oh, Cyrus was, before Ahasuerus.
Yes. And
Oh.
what happens is what happens is that at some point the Persian Empire swallows up the Babylonian Empire. And that's where Achashverosh comes into the picture. But I may be wrong about that. So let me look into that, and I'll get back to you on that. But
Okay.
Let me
Yes,
get back.
thank you.
Okay. Now there's a lot more to say about the story and where we want to take the story. But I think I want to look at one important point, and then maybe we'll go back. So again, the story unfolds that the king gets rid of his wife, and then he needs a new wife. So his ministers say, why don't you collect all the beautiful women from the kingdom, and you'll choose the most beautiful one. And he ends up choosing Esther. Now, Esther, what does the name Esther mean? So Esther, what is the name Esther? So the verse says that her name, let's pull up the verse. There was a man, I'm reading chapter 2. There was a Judean man in Shushan the capital, verse 5. Chapter 2, verse 5. There was a Judean man in Shushan the capital whose name was Mordechai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. So there's Mordechai. He was exiled from Jerusalem with the exile that was exiled with Yechaniah, king of Judah, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has exiled. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. So in other words, Mordechai raises his cousin Esther. But who is Esther? Her name is Hadassah. Hadassah, that is Esther. So she has two names. What's the meaning of the two names? So Hadassah is certainly a Hebrew name, means myrtle, which according to the Talmud represents righteousness. Hadassim, in the Bible, the term Hadassah refers to righteous people. But then she is Esther. What is Esther? There's a debate. Some people say in the Talmud that it's a Jewish name. Comes from the word Esther, concealment. Some people say it's a Persian name. Esther can mean Istahar, which means either dawn or either dawn, or it could mean in Persian, it could mean Venice. So there's all different interpretations. So it seems that she has a Hebrew name and a Persian name because she's living in Persia, and that's what the Jewish people had. Now she presents herself as Esther. She's concealing her identity. And that's clear that when she was taken, look at verse 10, Esther did not reveal her nationality or her heritage or her lineage, for Mordechai had ordered her not to reveal it. So she's taken to the king. She's not telling anybody who she's from, who she is, and what her nationality is. And this brings up a lot of discussion. Why not? Why does Mordechai tell Esther not to tell anybody, not to let anybody know her nationality, that she's Jewish? And presumably the king doesn't know about it until way later in the story. When she comes to him to nullify the decree, she says, by the way, it's my people. My people were prescribed for slaughter. And then he finds out that she's Jewish. So why does Mordechai tell her to hide her identity? Why doesn't Mordechai want her to be a proud Jewess? So there are all kinds of interpretations. The modern interpretation, which I don't like, I don't think is accurate, is that at this point, they're trying to assimilate. They don't want to stand out as Jews. And some people say that that's really what's really the transition that happens in the story, is that Mordechai and Esther, who's trying to hide and blend in, are forced to be proud Jews. But I don't think that's the story. That's certainly not the traditional reading. The traditional reading is that there are at least two interpretations of why Mordechai would tell Esther not to reveal her identity. And the two reasons are as follows. Rashi's reason is because Mordechai doesn't want Esther to be chosen as the queen. So the problem with Esther saying her lineage is if they know she's Jewish and they know she's from the tribe of Benjamin, And the tribe of Benjamin, she was a descendant. I don't know if a direct descendant. She was from the family of Kish. Kish is the father of Saul. So she's from a Jewish royal family. Now, if she's a Jewish royal family, that may be appealing to Achashverosh, because Achashverosh wants to marry a royal, doesn't want to marry just any person that has no lineage. So Mordechai says, I'm not. If you don't divulge your identity, then there's a chance that the king won't want to marry her, and that's Rashi's interpretation. Other interpretations, there are other interpretations, even Ezra, for example, he says no. He says that Mordechai wants Esther to be able to practice Judaism in hiding, even while in the palace. But to do that, people can't know she's Jewish. So for example, if she rests on Shabbat, if people don't know she's Jewish, so people think she's taking a vacation. But if they know she's Jewish, then they put one and two together and they realize that she's practicing Judaism. So Mordechai says, if people don't know your identity, it's not because they were trying to run away from Judaism, but because it's actually easier to practice Judaism if the people don't know that you're Jewish, if you're in the palace and you have very little autonomy over yourself. So those are the two reasons why Mordechai says, don't let anybody know who you are. Okay, we went to chapter 3. In chapter 3, Haman and Achashverosh have this discussion, and Haman wants to kill all the Jews because Mordechai doesn't bow to him. And he goes to the king and he says, you know what, we're going to write and we're going to agree. There's a nation that don't listen to you. They're spread around. They're a threat. We're going to let's destroy them. And the king agrees. That's chapter 3. What happens in chapter 4? Mordechai hears about it. He tears his clothing. He sends for Esther and he says, go to the king and tell the king that to nullify the decree. Esther doesn't want to go because she said it's dangerous. The king is a crazy king. If you come to him without permission, he'll kill you. I have not been called to the king for 30 days. So Mordechai, this back and forth between Mordechai and Esther is a very, very critical to understand the scroll, to understand the story. But what's important to understand is that finally, when Mordechai does persuade Esther to act, she does not do what he says. She has her own plan. She has a completely different plan. In other words, Mordechai's plan would be a terrible idea. She has a better idea. And that's a very interesting point, because according to some opinions, the real story here is the transition that happens within Esther. And that's what we want to follow, and that's what we want to look at in chapter 4. So the next stop we'll go to chapter 4 and try to follow what happens with Esther herself. What's the transition with Esther herself? But first, we have to look at the end of chapter 2, where the verse that I just read, Esther did not reveal her nationality or her lineage, for Mordechai had ordered her not to reveal it. So she doesn't tell anybody what her nationality is, because Mordechai said so. In other words, she's listening to Mordechai. Let's keep scrolling down. Again, verse 20 emphasizes the same points. Esther would not tell her lineage or her nationality as Mordechai had commanded her. For Esther kept Mordechai's orders as she had when she was raised by him. So it's not just saying she listened to him in this instance. In general, it's saying Esther listens to Mordechai. That's what happens, and that's what happens. That's their relationship. So even after she becomes the queen, she's listening to Mordechai. Now we'll skip a chapter or two. Chapter 3 is again the decree against the Jews. Chapter 4 is Mordechai hears about it. Let's go to chapter 4, verse 1. And Mordechai knew all that had transpired. And Mordechai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out to the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. And he came up as far as the king's gate, for one may not enter the king's gate.
But I was very diligent about putting the
I
sunscreen
was
on.
telling him that
He really doesn't understand.
when you guys go away, he should even have those as
Okay, so Mordechai comes to the he can't come to the palace, and then verse 3 says wherever the news arrives, everybody is in mourning, and in every province wherever the king's orders and his edict reached, there was great mourning for the Jews, and fasting and weeping and lamenting. Sackcloth and ashes were put on the most prominent. Okay, everybody knows about this decree because the news is spreading. The only person that doesn't know about it is Esther. She's totally oblivious. She has no idea. Verse 4. Esther's maidens and her chamberlains came and told her, and the queen was extremely terrified. And she sent clothing to dress Mordechai and to take off his sackcloth, but he did not accept. What was she terrified? She wasn't terrified about the decree because she didn't know anything about the decree. She was terrified that Mordechai, who was, as you read in the end of chapter 2, was a minister of the king and sat in the king's gate. Now he's running around with sackcloth. What's going on? Here, put on a normal suit so he can come and talk. Mordechai refuses. So she sends Hatach, who's one of her ministers, in verse 5, to speak to Mordechai to find out what's going on. So verse 7 is Mordechai tells her what happened and how Haman wanted to pay the Jews, the king, money to allow him to kill the Jews. She comes back to Mordechai. So Mordechai says, she should to order her to come before the king to beseech him and to beg for the people. And Hatach came and he told Esther what Mordechai had said. And Esther said to Hatach, and she ordered him to tell Mordechai, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who come to the king into the inner court who is not summoned, there is but one law for him, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king extends the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. Basically, she says, I can't go because the king is going to kill me. What does Mordechai say? And they told Esther's words to Mordechai. And Mordechai ordered to reply to Esther, do not, these are very powerful verses, 13 and 14 is very powerful. Do not imagine to yourself that you will escape to the king's house from among all the Jews. And verse 14, if you remain silent at this time, relief and rescue will arise for the Jews from elsewhere, and you and your father's household will perish. And who knows whether at a time like this, you will attain the kingdom. What is he saying here? Whatever he says, whatever it is, it worked. What does he say? So he says 2 points. In verse 13, he says, don't think you can escape from the Jewish fate. If you don't think you can run away from all the Jews to the king's palace. If you're going to be silent, then the Jews will be saved, but you may lose your chance. You and your house of your father may perish. And this is the key. Who knows whether this, for a time like this, you attain the kingdom? What Mordechai is telling Esther is, you have to realize that it's possible that the reason why you became a queen is only for this moment. In other words, what is he telling her? He's telling her that there's a reason why you're here, and you should utilize your capability and your access to realize that if God put you here for a purpose. So you should do what you can to do the right thing. But to think about that you were placed here for a reason. Now, this, according to one reading, is actually the point where the transformation happens within Esther. And where do you see this? You see this from this point and on. Esther does not, quote unquote, listen to Mordechai. Up to this point, we said already twice, Esther always listens to Mordechai, just like she has always listened to him when he raised her. From this point and on, Esther doesn't listen to Mordechai. The verse switches and says Mordechai listens to Esther. Mordechai does everything Esther had told him to do, which is exactly the opposite of what it said earlier. So it's not only that Mordechai listens to Esther, but she sort of does not do his plan. She does her own plan, which we'll talk about what that plan is. But it's fascinating to see that transformation. Up till now, she's listening to him. But once he tells her, you have to understand, you were placed here for a reason. Therefore what? Not therefore act. Therefore realize that God empowered you to be the right person at the right time. So she says, if so, okay, so I have to follow my instinct. I have to do what makes sense to me. If it's true that God put me here for a reason, then God also gives me the insight, and therefore I'm gonna listen to my own insight, and you, Mordechai, are gonna listen to me. So the tables have turned. And that's what happened immediately after 14. It says, Esther ordered to reply to Mordechai, and she says, go assemble all the Jews and make a fast for 3 days. And then I'm going to go to the king. And what happens? 17. So Mordechai passed and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. The exact opposite of what it says earlier, that Esther did everything that Mordechai said. Everything switches. Now, what does it mean Mordechai passed? So the Talmud says, what did he pass? It means he passed over the law of the Torah. Because if you do the calculations of when this story happened, this 3-day fast happened on Passover. So instead of eating matzah on Passover, the Jews fasted. That was a violation of the Torah. There's a biblical commandment to eat matzah. But Esther tells Mordechai to fast, and Mordechai listens despite the fact that he's passing over the mitzvah. So this is a big idea. This is the idea, the power of the idea that Esther understands that God sent her here for a reason, and she is the one that can save the Jews. She says, if so, it has to be my way. I have to listen to my instinct. And then she has a completely different plan than Mordechai, and that's what we're going to try to show and point out in the next few minutes. We have a few minutes left, but in the meantime, if anybody has any question, please share. I apologize, my throat's drying out just a little bit because it's a fast day called the Fast of Esther. The day before Purim is a fast day. And why are we fasting? There are different opinions. Some people, we say we commemorate the 3-day fast that we just read about. So that's why we're fasting today, or not a major fast, but that's why some people fast today.
Rabbi, I do have a question. Was that something that Mordechai wanted to do to empower Esther? Because that was his plan. So her replying by taking initiative is basically his plan. And the reason he did that, maybe he sensed that 70 years passed and we need to do something.
Well, was
waiting for the sign, and her selection as a queen probably was a sign for him.
Yeah, but that's a separate story. That's not the actual redemption. In other words, after the story concludes not with the going back to Israel, not with building the temple. The story concludes that Achashverosh puts a tax on the land. In other words, the story concludes we're now back comfortable living in the Persian Empire. It's not a story about going back to Israel. It's a story about exile. It's a story about God's presence, hidden presence, but presence nonetheless in exile. And that's really the power of the story. Power of the story is that even when we're in exile, God is with us, even if it's not obvious.
And the power is to be able to decide to kind of sense those signs, and that's what
recognize it for a reason. But to your first point, I don't think Mordechai realized how far Esther was going to take it. I think he was just trying to pressure her to do his plan. But then she says, if what you're saying is right, your plan is a disaster. I have a better plan. Now, what's Achashverosh's? What's Mordechai's plan? Mordechai's plan was, he tells her, you should go to the king and speak to him and tell him to nullify the decree. She doesn't do that. That's a terrible idea. It looks like she's doing it, but she's not doing it. What does she do? Let's go to chapter 5. What does she? Third day, she goes and greet the king. The king sees her. He puts out the scepter. She's not going to be killed. He says, what do you want? So what does she say? Verse 4. And Esther says, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. Instead of going to the king and saying, Haman is a bad guy. Let's get rid of him. He had made a decree to kill the Jews, and I happen to be Jewish. She says, no. She goes to the king and say, let's make a party with Haman, me, you, and Haman. Okay? Now you think the reader is sure. At the party, Esther is going to say to the king, okay, could you nullify Haman's decree? No, it's not what happens. What happens at the party? Verse 6. And the king said to Esther during the wine banquet, what is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? even up to half the kingdom shall be fulfilled. I'll give you whatever you want, even half the kingdom. Half the kingdom, the Talmud says half the kingdom means building the temple. Because there's a verse that he basically says, I'm giving you half, but not half. And the Talmud says, he's basically saying, I'm not doing everything for you. I'm not going to let you build the kingdom, build the temple. Because this is after the building of the temple stopped, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that I'm correct about that. I'm going to double check after the class that this was after Cyrus, but I'm going to double check. But in any case, what does she tell him? She says, what's my request? He says, you can have whatever you want, up to half my kingdom. She should say something like, why don't you spare the Jews? No. She says, I want another party tomorrow with Haman. Verse 8, if I have found favor in the king's eyes, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I will make for him, and tomorrow I will do the king's bidding. What does it mean, the king's bidding? So Rashi says from the Talmud, tomorrow I'll tell the king my nationality, because the king has been driving her crazy for the past 4 years, trying to figure out what nationality she's from, and she would not tell anybody. So she tells the king, you know what? I'll tell it to you tomorrow. So now what is she doing here? Mordechai says, go to the king, ask the king to nullify the decree. What does she do? She goes to the king, risks her life to go to the king. And what does she say? You and Haman come for a party. They come to the party. What does she say? She says, come to another party tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'll tell you what to do. What's she doing? She just building suspense? What exactly is happening here? Any suggestions? So the Talmud asks the question. The Talmud says, why did Esther invite Haman to a party? What is the purpose? And the Talmud answers no less than 10 answers. Some of them are funnier than others. One answer is basically, you have to keep your friends close and your enemies closer. You ever heard of that? Keep your friends. So she wants Haman close. Why does she want Haman close? Because who knows what he's plotting? Maybe she knows she's Jewish. Maybe she doesn't know. When Haman is at the table, you have more control. That's one interpretation. But there are other interpretations in the Talmud, and this is the one that Rashi says, and this is the one probably most likely, is that all she wants to do, she wants Achashverosh to be suspicious of Haman, as simple as that. She's trying to create the jealousy. Because if you're Achashverosh, imagine your wife tells you, we're going to go out for our anniversary, but I want to take one other guy friend along. So that's so strange. Why would you do that? Especially the king. So here she says, I have a very important request from the king, but only me, you, and Haman. Let's make a party. Okay, so once it's okay. Then she says, tomorrow is the big night. Tomorrow I'm going to tell you my nationality. Maybe we can invite Haman again. What that's doing is making Achashverosh suspicious of Haman, and saying maybe Haman and Esther are plotting to kill me. So Achashverosh is nervous. She's trying to make him nervous and suspicious of Haman. Now, different answers in the Talmud are basically saying the same thing. She's trying to make them suspicious. Maybe the king will kill both of them. Maybe, but that's a little more extreme. Let's just think about she's trying to make him suspicious of Haman. Now, did her plan succeed? Did her plan work? The answer, of course, it worked like a charm. What happened that night? Let's go to chapter 6. You know the story. What happened in chapter 6 that night? That night, on that night between the two parties, the king's sleep was disturbed. He could not sleep. And he ordered to bring the book of the records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordechai had reported about Bigtana and Teresh, two chamberlains of the king, of the guards of the threshold, who had sought to lay hand on King Achashverosh. What happened? In the end of chapter 2, there were two people tried to kill the king. Mordechai heard about it, told Esther, who told the king, and the king's life was saved. It was written down in the book of the Chronicles. They forgot about it. Nothing was done for Mordechai. What happens here? The king can't sleep. So he says, do me a favor, bring me my records. Did that ever happen to you? You can't sleep. So let me go check my tax returns. It doesn't make any sense. What do you mean? You can't sleep. Can't sleep. So give me my diary. What's going on? There's no Netflix? Okay, I mean, some other form of entertainment. So the Rashi explains so beautifully. He's nervous that maybe there's a plot between Esther and Haman to kill him. So he says, who could I trust in my palace? If there's a plot, who is going to protect me? Let me read. Let me see what's going on. Who could I trust? And then what does he read? He reads that Mordechai saved the king by telling the queen. Oh, so now he knows he has one ally. Who's his one ally? Mordechai. What happens immediately then? Then Haman comes to the king and he wants to ask the king, could you give me permission to kill Mordechai? Because there was a whole story over there that as soon as he left the party, he saw Mordechai not bowing. He got so upset. He said, I'm going to kill Mordechai right away. I'm not going to wait till the 13th of Adar. And then, so think the irony. The only person, the king, Haman doesn't realize this. The king is suspicious of Haman and trusts Mordechai. And at that moment, Haman is coming to the king to convince the king to allow Haman to kill Mordechai. It would never happen. And at that point is the turnaround of the story where the king asks Haman, what should we do to the person who king wishes to honor? And Haman thinks the king is talking about himself. He doesn't realize that the only person in this kingdom, the one person in the kingdom that the king is most afraid of is Haman. So the Haman says, let them ride on a horse. Oh, what does Haman say? Haman says, the king wants to honor somebody, let them put that person on a horse, the king's horse, with the king's garments, with the king's crown. If you're Achashverosh, you say, what is it? What's going on here? The guy wants the king's crown. My suspicion about Haman and Esther must be true. So he's completely suspicious of Haman. And then on the next day, when Esther finally delivers the final blow and says, this guy is no good, then he's open and he's willing to get rid of Haman, and that's the turnaround. So Esther does not do what Mordechai does. She has her own plan, which absolutely ends up working. There's a lot more to say, but time is running out. I wanted to leave a minute or two for questions, but I do want to say that the mitzvot of the day are unique. We hear the Megillah, that's okay. We make a party, we eat, festive meal, okay. But there's also two other mitzvot. Mitzvot of sending gifts of food from person to their friend and giving gifts to the poor. Why do we do this? What does this have to do with Purim? To send gifts of the poor, send gifts of food to each other. So there are various interpretations, maybe just a sign of increased joy. But one interpretation is, if you look at what Haman tells the king, he says, there's one nation, but they're scattered around your kingdom. And the Talmud says it doesn't just mean scattered around the kingdom in the literal sense. It means it in the figurative sense. Haman was complaining that the Jews are not unified. And to counter that, we emphasize the opposite is true. We're not we may be scattered around the nations in the literal sense, but we're not scattered in the figurative sense. We are one, united, and strong. And sending the gifts of food highlights the brotherhood and sisterhood between the people. And that's one of the reasons why that mitzvah was instituted for Purim. So there's plenty more to say. We're just touching the surface. But I figured a little bit to get our feet wet. And again, if anyone has any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful Purim.